Production funding for Ruckus has been provided by gifts from Dave and Jamie Cummings, the Hartwig family, Barbara and Peter Gattermeyer, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Ruckus, where we fight tooth and nail and sometimes tongue-in-cheek over the news of the day and the trends of the times. I'm Mike Shannon. The Ruckettes join me shortly. And our topics this week: the Kansas governor's race, front and center and left and right in plain view, the new Westport security system, and is there something fishy going on at the zoo? Plus, of course, roast and toast. But we start with our interview segment and take a look at the campaign season with special focus on the Kansas governor's race and the U.S. Senate race in Missouri. And joining me for that is Dr. Patrick Miller, a political science professor from KU. Dr. Miller, welcome to Ruckus. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We are told by a lot of analysts there's a great deal of enthusiasm across the country for this year's congressional races for the House and the Senate. Do you sense that kind of enthusiasm in Kansas for the gubernatorial race?
I think there's definitely a lot of enthusiasm just across the board politically. Certainly, if we look at the primaries, I mean, Kansas was a little bit different this year in that both parties had contested hot primaries that were unpredictable in some ways, and turnout was definitely up, especially for the Democrats. Certainly more Republicans voted than Democrats, but the advantage that Republicans had in turnout was far down. So certainly a lot of enthusiasm, especially for Democrats this year.
Let me ask you about the three major candidates for governor and get a thumbnail reaction from you about each. Let's start with Greg Orman running as the independent.
Greg Orman obviously ran for Senate actually twice before, first as a Democrat, dropped out, then as an independent in 2014. He's an interesting candidate to me. We have two polls in the race, and he's polling distant third, far behind Laura Kelly and Chris Kobach. He's at about 10%, give or take. He labels himself a centrist, but he's pretty consistently liberal on policies. And in fact, to the extent that he's tried to draw a contrast with Laura Kelly, he's actually, and his camp has been hitting her from the left on guns and Medicaid expansion and voter regulation. So to me, the most interesting thing is how he balances liberal policies with creating a centrist image, and the question of who he draws from in the end, which ultimately I think will be Laura Kelly.
We'll get to that in a moment. What about Democrat Laura Kelly, a state senator, next door neighbor to former Governor Kathleen Sebelius?
Right, so she's been in the state Senate, first elected in 2004, represents a pretty Republican district, wins tough races. A very credible candidate, a centrist Democrat. She obviously just got the endorsement of the former Republican governor, Bill Graves, which was a real coup for her. She's about tied with Kobach in the polls, and I think she has enough money to run a race, but really, the dynamic between her and Orman and how many votes go to him as a potential spoiler will be interesting.
And how about Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State?
All right, Chris Kobach, high-profile national politician. He's become one, certainly in the Trump mold of Republican conservatives. In many ways, a very unorthodox campaign. I mean, talking a lot about really national issues, immigration especially, which we think of as more of a federal issue, heavily self-funded by his lieutenant governor candidate, yet he's viable in the polls, tied with Kelly. His campaign is very interesting to watch and very unusual.
He was sort of Trump-like before there was Trump on the national
absolutely,
scene.
right.
There's nothing new about the way Chris Kobach behaves politically.
Nothing new. He was talking about a lot of the issues that Trump ended up talking about, not trade as much, but certainly immigration and potential voter fraud long before Trump was. And I think in style, they're quite different. They're both smart politicians are also very good at putting on a show, and I think Kobach knows how to do that and get media attention.
Kobach is far more articulate than President Trump.
Oh, yes, I mean, for sure.
Greg Orman, you mentioned, we talked about. Does he really have any impact on the race? Is he going to hurt Kelly or Kobach or either, or both?
Well, I think after 9 months of campaigning and advertising, he's been on the air for quite some time, to only be at 10% has to be a disappointment for him. And he is simply not in contention with Kelly and Kobach at this point. He really is in a distant third. And even with independents, Laura Kelly is beating him almost 4-1. And so I think you know, with how Orman is running, I don't see how he draws from Kobach or hurts Kobach. I see him as someone, you know, leftist policies, centrist image, certainly drawing more from Kelly.
Kelly than from Kobach,
Right.
I would assume. Do you think at this point, and I realize no one knows for sure, do you think Kobach is the likely winner, given what you just said about Orman and Kelly?
I think Orman puts a bigger ceiling on Kelly. He definitely limits her room to grow and possibly gives Kobach more room to grow. That said, in the two polls we have right now, Kelly and Kobach are tied. So I think long term, watching their numbers and exactly how much Orman gets, it's going to be very interesting math.
Let's jump over to Missouri and that important Senate race. Incumbent Claire McCaskill running against Missouri Attorney General Josh Hawley. Polls are close, but I think McCaskill, at last report I read, is 3 or 4 points ahead.
Right, there was just a poll out yesterday that had her up 4. And the polling has been consistently tight in this race. I mean, definitely, I think, average it all out, you would call it a toss-up. Sometimes she's up a little, sometimes he's up a little, and there definitely is a lot of money, many millions of dollars in outside spending coming into the race. So it's clearly quite close.
Is it really important to McCaskill how she, and to voters, how she comes down on the Brett Kavanaugh nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court?
Probably
she won't
not.
say. At least she said she's going to make a statement, I think, later this week. But does it really matter to her voters and supporters?
No, I mean, if you look in the polling, most people who care about Supreme Court nominations, they are solidly partisan anyway. And whether you're for or against Kavanaugh or anyone else, you probably know who you're voting for in the end. I mean, that said, with as close as the race is, if there are 100 or 1,000 voters here and there, they may be a very small chunk for whom that might really be a swing issue. It might be something that she cares about.
A great interview. Thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate your time.
Sure. Thank you.
Come back and see us again.
Thank you.
That is KU political science professor Dr. Patrick Miller. Now let's meet the panel and start a ruckus. Jamaica Kendricks is an educator and education activist. Steve Rose is a Johnson County civic leader and a Kansas City Star columnist. Sean Saving is a labor activist and part of the Heartland Labor Forum at KKFI Radio. And Crosby Kemper III is director of the Kansas City Library System and host of KCPT's Meet the Past and Centropolis programs. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for coming in and being part of the program today. Well, in case there was still any doubt, and I'm sure there wasn't, the race for Kansas governor is underway. During last week's debate on KCPT, moderator Nick Haynes asked the 3 major candidates about their top priorities. GOP hopeful Chris Kobach said tax cuts and budget cuts. Democrat Laura Kelly offered more education spending and Medicaid expansion, while the independent Greg Orman emphasized economic development. Beyond the debate, there were other developments. Former GOP Governor Bill Graves issued a statement in support of Democratic nominee Kelly, and the Kansas State Council of Firefighters gave its endorsement to Kobach. Typically, labor groups endorse Democrats. In Mr. Rose's column last weekend, Steve seems to suggest that, awful as he thinks it would be, Kobach is likely to win because of President Donald Trump. So, Steve, how did you reach this, I would say, interesting conclusion?
Well, because they're basically clones. Going back 14 years ago, Chris Kobach was running for Congress, and before it was even popular to say it, he was harping on illegal immigration. And those of us who lived in the 3rd District said, what in the world is he bringing out before we don't, that's not an issue in the 3rd District. But he was, if you want to say it, farsighted enough to recognize that that was going to be a wedge issue going forward. So I see that similarity with Trump. I see a similarity of style, which is to say I think they're mean, nasty, both people. And I think they tend to lie a lot. And
that makes them unique in politics?
I think, huh?
That makes them unique in politics?
They seem to do a bigger and better job of it than anybody I've ever heard. And I wouldn't be surprised, and other people have said this too, if Kobach doesn't think that he's on his way toward the presidency himself, and that the governor's seat would be a great launching pad to become Trump after Trump is finished.
Well, you know, it would seem to me after reading your column that you doubt that anybody who voted for Trump or would vote for Kobach is sophisticated or smart. Do you think Kobach and Trump voters are just complete idiots and have no merit?
Geez, I didn't read that column, Mike. And I don't know.
Well, you know, you wrote it.
I don't think I wrote it either. What I did say was that I think there's a similarity between the voters who are supporting almost in a cult-like way Donald Trump and in a cult-like way Chris Kobach, in the sense that, you know, it was Trump who said, if I shoot the gun, you know, shoot somebody
on Fifth Avenue,
in Fifth Avenue, that I won't lose a single vote. And he was ahead of his time. He was right. He knew that. He knew that early. And I think that Kobach's followers similarly will follow him all the way, no matter which, you know, how
I
far
think
he goes.
one of the points that actually was in your column, you think that Greg Orman will have an impact on Laura Kelly and make it easier for Kobach to win. I want to ask Jamika, do you think that's the case?
It could be, but I disagree with Steve about why the voters would actually go and support Kobach, especially the Trump voters, because I don't think that he has like the lying and all that in common that's going to get them to vote. I think what he has in common with Trump is that he speaks to voters' frustrations. I think Orman has more in common, because Orman actually speaks to the voters' frustrations, and then he doesn't have a clear plan about how he's going to address those frustrations. And that's something Trump did. Orman is also a political outsider, and I think what's get lost a lot of times when we're talking about folks who supported Trump is we're thinking he got in because conservative Republicans wanted him. Well, there were voters who wanted someone who was a political outsider. They were tired of being lied to by politicians. So I think the attributes that were given to him don't necessarily say whether or not he would win. So I think Orman actually does have a good chance. I don't think he'll probably win because he's running as an independent. So yes, he will affect it. I'm hoping that he actually comes out with a win.
Very quickly before we have to move on, Sean, what was your reaction to this firefighter group endorsing Kobach? Was that a big surprise?
Maybe it was a surprise. You know, it's not uncommon for firefighters, police unions to endorse Republicans. I'm not sure the logic behind what they were doing there. When you look at what Kobach is talking about for government services and funding, if he were to be elected, I don't see how firefighters come out ahead in a Kobach administration. So
I regret that we took too much time, or I took too much time at the beginning of this, so we do have to move on. Sorry. We could have gone on for much longer. The latest effort to secure the Westport Entertainment District during late night and early morning hours on weekends is now underway. City has allowed some streets in the area to be privatized during those hours. Westport merchants then can use barricades and establish boundaries where visitors must undergo security checks before entry. Metal detectors to check for weapons are part of the arrangement. Anyone who sets off the detectors is subject to further examination. Westport officials say their security is similar to what patrons experience at public buildings, stadiums, and concert venues. This new security setup is only a couple of weeks old. Does it look like this approach might be the one to work, Sean?
I can't see that it's going to make much difference. I mean, a couple of things. One, they're not blocking off that large of an area. It's a lot of the stuff that happens in Westport, the crimes that I'm familiar with, I know friends have been mugged or assaulted, it happens when you're walking back to your car a few blocks away from where you were. This is more of a psychological thing as far as I can tell. I mean, and also it doesn't start till 11 p.m. So you can carry your gun in at 10:45 and shoot somebody at 11:05. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But I think we can't miss the irony of this situation is that we have Second Amendment absolutists worried about the government encroaching on their freedom, so we have to have absolute carry of any kind of gun wherever you want. And now we have the private sector. So the solution is the private sector now encroaches on people's freedom. I think we can't miss that's what's happening.
Jamika, I'm sure you're in Westport every weekend. Do you think this is the solution to the problem?
I have actually not been in Westport on the weekend in over 2 years, because when they started blocking it off and requiring ID, I was like, there's too much traffic. It's creating too much chaos. It's no longer convenient. I'll go somewhere else. And I think that with Westport, one of the things that in the city they do a lot, well, actually in government they do a lot, is they don't look to best practices. It's like, we have a problem, let's come up with a solution of our own. And when I was looking at information about security in entertainment districts, I found a study that Kansas City was actually included in, where they looked at 40 entertainment districts in 16 different states that were experiencing problems with safety. And I'm wondering, did we talk to any of those other people included in the study so we can better understand what works and what doesn't?
I got to get Wes Crosby into this discussion because I've ignored you regrettably in the first part of the program. Do these merchants in Westport have any choice but to do something to try to
they've got to do something,
stem the violence?
and you always do. I agree with Jamika. I think there's the best practices to this. One of the, I'm sufficiently old that I know Westport's gone through this probably a half dozen times before in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And what you really need is a combination of more security in the institutions, the bars and restaurants. And you need a bigger police presence, and the police presence goes up and down with this. I will say, I do spend some time in Westport, not usually that late on Friday or Saturday night. I never see a police officer on the street. I never see a police, and I'm in other areas of the city where there is high crime, and I never see a police officer on the street. A lot of this comes down to community policing and establishing a real community policing regime in our law enforcement, which we don't have today.
Steve, the Star editorial board says Westport should not look like a crime zone and calls for other solutions. But what other solutions are there?
I don't know the answer to the second part, but I will tell you that I agree on the first part. I think that it's going to hurt business in Westport. And I think that when people go out for a good time, it's different than going through an airport security. They expect to come and let it loose and just enjoy the heck out of an entertainment area. You start out, by going through the metal detectors, and they check your purse, and they check your this, and they check your that. I think it takes a lot of the flavor out of Westport, and I'm sorry to see that they had to come to that.
Over the years on Ruckus, when you've been on, you've been concerned about the plaza. Are you still concerned about the plaza's survival?
I don't know about survival. I think the plaza has already been hurt. There's I don't know what the percentage of open stores or empty stores are, but there's a lot of them. And I think that it's very possible, that when the streetcar starts coming down closer to the plaza, it may bring a lot of people with it. That it'll be easy to hop on and then hop off and kind of hang out at the plaza.
If that happens, and we don't know for sure it will happen because there's a request for federal funding,
right?
And who knows how that will turn out?
Well,
probably.
I think it's going to go, but I don't know.
It still takes time to build.
It does,
even if they get the approval.
Does.
All right, we have to move on. Kansas City's long quest to build an aquarium may soon come to fruition. One of the early ideas for Union Station's revival was an aquarium. The original Gateway Mission project, if you can remember back that long ago, involved plans for an aquarium. Now the Kansas City Zoo may actually acquire one. The $75 million cost would be paid by existing zoo sales taxes, private contributions, and $7 million from the city, approved by voters last year when they approved the GO bonds. There's some debate about that. So, Crosby, are we about to see the dawning of the age of aquariums?
That's an awful joke, Mike.
I know it is. That's why I saved it.
So my response is, we also all of a sudden have an interest on the part of the city, which it hasn't had for 40 years, in affordable housing. This clearly is part of that, affordable housing for fish. Look, we have a good zoo. Randy Westhoff's doing a great job. We could have a better zoo. That'd be great. It should be paid for with private dollars. It has a fairly narrow base.
All of it should be paid by private dollars?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The city didn't tell us they were going to use this money for GO bonds. The city's taking property tax money. Somebody's talked about the 8-cent sales tax on the east side being used for this. Which would be crazy. It should be privately funded.
I think they've backed off on on using the GO. The latest on that is they're going to find $7 million somewhere else out of their $1.6 billion budget.
I think the City Finance Committee on Wednesday said no to the GO bond money, and on Thursday as we tape the program.
But I don't understand why this should be paid for with private money when the zoo isn't paid for with private money. Why do you distinguish?
Some of the zoo is paid for.
Well, some of it is, but you're suggesting that all of the aquarium be paid for by private dollars.
Yeah, I think the purpose of an aquarium compared to the other purposes, I mean, the city is finally talking about affordable housing. The city takes huge money from the school district and the library every year to do development projects. Here's another thing that's essentially an upper middle class amenity.
Yes.
While we have really serious problems in education, taxes, housing, across the board in the inner city. So we're going to tax people in the inner city to send money for affordable housing for fish.
So Sean, would you go to an aquarium?
I like fish. You know, who doesn't like fish? I mean, but
Well,
yeah.
but for dinner, but would you go see them at
Yeah, I mean, the aquarium in Omaha is great. Again, though, it's if you're going to use, if anything, go outside of Kansas City. I mean, we are the regional attraction for everybody in the metro area, and we're the only ones that pay for any of it, and except for a few exceptions. And you know, let's not forget, just today there was an announcement that the developers got his hand out for $20 million for a high-rise luxury hotel.
$500 a night rooms. $500 a night rooms.
So it's just we got this dependency, this developer's dependency on public money has to stop.
There have been many efforts to build an aquarium in Kansas City, as I mentioned in the introduction to this piece. Do you think this time it'll work?
If it does work, I don't know if it will, but if it does, I would prefer for it not to be funded by the public. And I have to say, I love aquariums. I went to Atlanta 5 years ago, went to their aquarium. I loved it. One of the best experiences or attractions there for me, but I don't want to pay for that when there are so many other things, like Crosby said, that are happening in our city that need our public dollars, and then we're going to put it out for this. I'm not for that.
But it's going to bring in supposedly, and I think their projections.
In money that doesn't go to those communities that need it right now, who are going to have to pay for this. Because when that money comes in, the East Side is still going to look like it does if we continue to allow people to take money out of it to pay for middle class amenities.
Well, the tax is already there. They're not. It's not like they're going out and asking for a new tax. The money that most of the funding is going to come from private donations and from a tax that's an existing tax.
Well, that's
So if
fine.
it's
They can
something
spend their
that's
money
great-
there any way they want to.
Yes.
No new taxes.
It's less than 10% of the project cost that they're asking for. So if you can't find $7 million in some other way,
They'll find it. They'll find it.
Okay, then find it.
yeah.
We're all in favor of that.
Yes,
Yeah.
find the money.
Steve, do you sense great community interest in building an aquarium?
I don't know if I think, well, they project, and you know, their projections have been very, very good at the zoo. I remember when the zoo had an attendance that was about the same as the Deanna Rose Farmstead in Overland Park, and I'm not kidding. And now there's over 1 million people coming, and they're saying if they brought an aquarium here, it would bring 400,000 more people here for this particular amenity. I think that I can't see how it loses because it's going to be very, very popular.
Right.
Any of us who've been to Chicago or anywhere else,
They can ticket it, Steve, and pay for it themselves.
and you know what? I think that they are going to ticket. They're talking about raising the prices. As you know, people who are not in the taxing district pay twice as much per ticket as the people who are in the district. So if they raise the fees and raise the funds on the outsiders, that helps pay for it.
All right, I think we have to move on now and head to the soapbox for Roast and Toast, where the Ruckettes have 30 seconds each to agitate, contemplate, or obfuscate. And we start with Sean, who may do all three.
My roast this week goes out to the anonymous supposed resistance fighter in the White House. If, as your editorial suggests, the president may indeed be unfit for office, it is your duty to initiate the 25th Amendment and have him removed. But instead, you hope to reassure us that the adults in the room are keeping the president's worst impulses in check, all the while advancing your political party's agenda as Rome burns. There are no adults in the White House, only treasonous, self-serving cowards.
Steve, did you write that New York Times op-ed? You didn't. All right, Jamaica.
I'm reading today, so I'll go fast.
It's all right. No, take your time. We're okay.
Okay, so I am toasting LeBron James today. So I've always admired him for his commitment to his family, for his commitment to his profession, and his commitment to his community. And so today I'm toasting him for acknowledging the importance of strong public school systems and working with the Akron Public Schools to provide opportunities for students living in the area around his hometown that they wouldn't otherwise have, rather than establishing a charter school to compete with or discredit public school systems. So,
Mr. Kemper?
So I'd like to toast the library board and the Friends of the Library who are putting on the ballot a modest, a very small tax increase, 8 cents, to support the work of the library. 25% of our population doesn't have access to the internet. 70% of the kids in the Kansas City School District don't have access at home. The library does 800,000 computer sessions a year that makes up for that. We need that money to continue to do that, and I toast them.
All right, Steve Rose.
Well, as we are listening to this program tonight, we're unfortunately experiencing what may be a major catastrophe in the Carolinas, in Georgia and other areas around there. So I'd like to certainly say something, a toast or whatever you say, for the people who are going to go through this, and a roast to the people who think that global warming is a hoax.
All right, and finally, here is a toast to a Minneapolis company that is offering its employees who are new pet owners a chance to work from home for a week so they can bond with their new dog or cat. A spokesman for the company says a lot of people think their pets are their children, and perhaps that's why the company calls its policy fraternity leave. And that is Ruckus for this week. We're back next Thursday at 7. Now for the Ruckettes and the crew, I'm Mike Shannon saying thanks very much for watching and good night.